windows. We see a tall glass building, which is a new office building. Behind that we see a rectangle building with blue top and windows. Right behind that is where the new Jewish settlement of Hebron begins. And this is an unbelievable story. After the 1967 war, the Jewish people returned back home to Hebron and to all of Judea and Samaria and to Jerusalem. But unfortunately, the government didn't know exactly what to do with the situation, and they were not allowing Jews to come live in Hebron. Jews were insisting on coming back home to their homeland, and one of the leaders of the Jewish settlement movement, Rabbi Moshe Levinger, came up with an idea, and they actually rented a few rooms for Passover in an Arab hotel, which is called Park Hotel. And they came over, they were here for Passover. And they decided they wanted to stay on. And they insisted on staying on. They stayed on in the Park Hotel, which was right, as I pointed out, right over there. We can't see the building itself, but it's right behind that building, that rectangular building over there. And they stayed here and insisting the government to give permission to build Jewish Hebron. After a few weeks of discussion in the cabinet, there was the final decision that they're going to build a Jewish neighborhood right near Hebron called Kiryat Arba. And at the time, Minister Yigal Allon came up with that decision, and it was approved by Golda Meir, and later on by Yitzhak Rabin, and they established the city of Kiryat Arba, which at first was going to be the Jewish neighborhood near Hebron. Later on, we see, that the Jewish people decided that we're not going to stay with being outside Hebron. They decided they wanted to move into Hebron, and we'll talk about that as we continue on. Here we are continuing up, walking towards, upon the outskirts of Hebron, the original ancient Hebron, and we are going to be walking towards one of the most dramatic places in Hebron. We're going to be walking to the cemetery, the ancient cemetery of Hebron. The ancient cemetery of Hebron tells the story, the history of the connection between the people of Israel and Hebron. We're walking down, as we can see. We have a path there that will take us all the way directly to the Jewish cemetery of Hebron. The Jewish cemetery, which will tell us a lot about the permanent connection of the people of Israel to Hebron for thousands of years. The connection of the people of Israel to Hebron did not begin yesterday, did not begin a few weeks ago, did not even begin in our century, or even not in this decade. The connection of the Jewish people to Hebron begins, as we said, on Abraham. Abraham, who buys the plot of burial for his wife, Sarah. The first purchase of land in Israel. First purchase of land in Eretz Israel. And here we are now on the outskirts of the cemetery. We will be walking along the fence, and we can see here already the ancient parts of the cemetery. But unfortunately, this part of it has not been rebuilt and renewed through the ruin that has gone through here, through the history. And we will talk about that when we get into the cemetery. But if you can see, to my right and to my left, on the right side, we have tombstones that are still original stones of burial. One thing maybe I'll point out right now, as you can see, one of the traditions which made it pretty difficult here in Hebron, one of the traditions of the Jewish people in Hebron was not to mark any names on the graves. So therefore, the only way we know who's buried where is different maps which we found through the history. But here we have graves that we don't even know exactly the names of the people. We know that they belonged to the Jewish Sephardi community. But here we're going to go into the cemetery itself, which is now being renovated after what it went through throughout history. And we will talk about that as we approach the entrance to the cemetery. We see on the outskirts of the cemetery this tree here which expresses life. But even a cemetery in a city expresses an eternal connection, something that we're not here temporarily, something that we're not here just to live, but actually to be here for good. The people of Israel are here in the land of Israel for good, and we are here. We'll pick this up and put it in the garbage so that we don't dirty the city of Hebron, the city of our forefathers. We'll put that into the garbage. And now I'm walking to the entrance to the cemetery. We have to surround it because it's surrounded and protected today. Unfortunately, it went through quite a lot of damage throughout history. But today it's being renovated, and it really is something special. In order to enter the cemetery, we have to be sure that it's open. I do hope there's somebody who will be able to let us in. I'm going to check and yeah, it's open, and we're entering now the cemetery. Entering the cemetery. Wow, so many things that are going on here. And we'll have to understand and learn about the cemetery. Here we are, I'm right now entering the cemetery, this unbelievable cemetery. The cemetery is divided into three. The ancient part of it, the story of the Jewish people of Hebron throughout history, and the modern part. We're going to start actually from what we call here the plot of the rabbis, the plot of the holy rabbis that have been buried here. This is the ancient part of the cemetery. And I want to show you how many great rabbis are buried here in the city of Hebron. We're going to sit down right over here and talk about it. Here we are. I'm going to sit in the shade over here just for a second. and we'll get a look at what's going on here. Here, what we can see over here, as I mentioned, is the history of the Jewish people living in Hebron. The Jewish people have been living in Hebron throughout history. We know of many different communities who have been living here. One of the very first people living in Hebron was in the 16th century. I'm going to show you some pictures that I have here of what the graves looked like at the time. Let's find it. Let's see where it is. List of the students of the Ari, who was one of the leaders of the Kabbalah movement in Tzfat. He comes from Tzfat, and in 1566 he becomes the chief rabbi of Hebron, and he passed away in 1587. He decides that they decide to make a big grave for him, and here we have the original grave. Unfortunately, in the time of the Jordanians, between 1948 and 1967, the entire cemetery was totally destroyed. And just right a few years ago, they rebuilt the grave of Rabbi Eliyahu Davidash, the writer of the book Reshit Chochmah, and they did it exactly the way it looked like originally. What I wanted to show you in the other picture, right over here, we can take a look, one more picture I have over here. We can see that throughout history, people would come and pray at his grave. And here we have a picture. We'll see another picture of people praying at the grave. Here we'll show you, we'll see this. Here we'll try to get to see if we can find that picture. We'll see in a second. And here we see people praying at the grave. Here we see people praying at that grave. This picture was taken in the 1920s. Till then, people were still praying at the grave of the Reshit Chochmah. Students from all over would come to see and to pray, because it was believed that this rabbi was a great rabbi. He wrote the very famous book called Reshit Chochmah. And here we have a picture of people praying at his grave in the 1920s. So, aside from the Rabbi Davidash, we have some other interesting rabbis who are buried here. We have the famous Rabbi Eliyahu Mani, who was the chief rabbi of Hebron in the 1900s, in the 19th century. He was very famous and very known to the people. Very interesting in the story is that when he was dying, he calls over his children and he tells them he feels that he's going to die very early. And if we can see something very interesting, all the graves here are all buried, like the tradition of Israel, are all buried facing Jerusalem. All the graves here are facing Jerusalem, except for these two. Rabbi Mani asks to be buried together with his wife, facing the Me'arat HaMachpelah, facing the cave of Abraham. And here we are, his son, who was buried right next to him, Rabbi Suleiman Mani, is already buried the way all the other graves are, facing Jerusalem. But he and his wife requested to be buried facing the tomb of Abraham, and here we are. Another interesting story is the story of Rabbi Avraham Azulai, the Chesed Avraham, who is well known as a rabbi here in Hebron. The story over here about Rabbi Avraham Azulai, I'm just gonna. זה פה, אני רק לא יודע למה אין פה את השלט, אוקיי. אין פה את השלט, לא יודע, אוקיי. זה המקום, זה הקבר של רבי אברהם אזולאי, אני חושב, וזה כמעט פתוח, רגע. לא יודע למה אין פה את השלט. אני כמעט בטוח שזה זה. לא, הנה, זה, פה. לא, זה כן זה. Rabbi Avraham Azulai was here also in the beginning, in the end of the 19th century. The story was that there was one of the Turkish sultans came to visit Hebron, and he comes to the grave of the patriarchs, as Avram's grave, and his sword falls down into a hole through the grave. He sends down somebody to pick it up, the guy drops dead. He sends out a second person to pick it up, the guy drops dead. He sent a third person to pick it up, and the guy drops dead. And there's a tradition that anybody who goes into that cave drops dead. And people were afraid to go in there. Suddenly the Sultan calls the Jewish people and he says, "You were ordered to bring one of your people to go down into the cave and pick up the Sultan's sword." Rabbi Avraham Azulai, who was then serving as a very famous rabbi here in Hebron, says, "I'm going to do it." He goes in, he comes out with the sword, he calls all those people, and he tells them that when he was down there in the grave, he heard the voice of Abraham. And Abraham said, "You're going to come out of here safely, give the sword to the Sultan, but right afterwards, a few days later, you're going to join me in heaven." And 3 days later, Rabbi Avraham Azulai passed away, but he saved the entire Jewish people of Hebron, because the Sultan had warned them if they weren't going to bring him the sword, he would kill them. But we're going to continue now. We pass by here the grave of Rabbi Shlomo Ba'adani from Yemen, who was a very famous rabbi known as the Melechet Shlomo. But from here, I would like to go on to the next part of the cemetery and see another part of history. If you join me, please do. We're climbing up out of the area of the cemetery, the graves of the righteous great rabbis of Hebron, and we're walking up to another section which is a very moving story, very painful story, very painful story to the city of Hebron. Here we are in this part of the cemetery. As you can see, here we have 59 graves. We're going to take a look. What is this special part of the cemetery? As I said, the Jewish people were living here for many, many years. Throughout history, we saw rabbis from the 16th century, from the 17th century, 18th and 19th century. But in 1929, August 1929, Yud Chet Av, when the Jews of Hebron were in wonderful relationship with their neighbors, suddenly, out of the clear blue, massacres had begun in Jerusalem. But that very painful day, Friday afternoon, and then Shabbat, hundreds and thousands of Arabs burst in to the houses of the Jewish community, to the houses of the yeshiva, the students of the yeshiva, and with cold ammunition, with knives, axes, swords, stones, they killed 70 of the inhabitants of Hebron. Without any reasoning, without any asking questions. 1929, Shabbat, Yud Chet Av, August 1929. The graves, the decision was of the 70 that were killed, 59 of them were buried here after they identified each and every one of them, and they were buried over here in the cemetery. As you can see here, I'll show you one of the very painful parts of this whole story was after they identified each and every one of the graves, they found a lot of remainings of bodies that were not identified, and they buried in one of the graves. The blood of clothing that were not identified, and here we see the blood of those holy, pure Jews who were killed here when the massacres of Yud Chet Av. And here we see the burial of the blood. Damam shel 59 nefashot were buried right over here. The graves themselves were all over here. Though in between 1948 and 1967, this part of the cemetery was also totally destroyed. If you look around here, it's all empty. This was all full of graves. And the Arabs over here destroyed each and every one of the graves that were here, including those of the students of the yeshiva who were killed in 1929. Here we can see some of the original grave stones. Here we can see right over here, we have a stone from the original grave of Rabbi Dravkin, and we have people of all ages. They killed students of the yeshiva. They killed, here the Rabbi Lichtenstein, and many others of the students. Here we have all the students. All of these are the students of the yeshiva, Talmid Yeshiva from Philadelphia, Talmid Yeshiva from Russia, Talmid Yeshiva. All of these are students of the yeshiva who were learning here at the yeshiva. Just in a few years ago, Rabbi Zalman Koren was appointed by the chief rabbinate to try to identify the exact in each and every one of the graves, and they reburied. Buried the bones, and they made monuments in memory of each and every one of those who were killed. In 1970s, we said the people of the Jews returned to Hebron, and here I want to continue on, where everything here in Hebron, nothing comes easy. Nothing comes at ease. The story that I want to tell you right now is the story of this grave. Avraham Yedidya. Avraham Yedidya, as a matter of fact, that also. Then comes the story of this child here, Avraham Yedidya. He was born in the month of Adar, 1975. His mother insists. She wants him to have a Brit Milah. She wants him to be circumcised in the cave, in the tomb Merat HaMachpelah. The government says it does not give permission. She insists and she insists and she insists, and finally, a day before the Brit, she gets the permission, and they have the Brit inside Merat HaMachpelah after she sort of got it in there. The child, Avraham Yedidya, received his name Avraham after his forefather Abraham. He is the first person to have his Brit in Hebron in our days. But unfortunately, just a few months after he was born, the child is only 4 months old. Suddenly, of the clear blue sky, his mother wakes up in the morning and sees that Avraham Yedidya passed away. She decides to take the child, and the government, the army asked her, "What's going on? When is the funeral?" She said, "No, we're not going to the funeral to Jerusalem. I want my son to be buried in Hebron, in the ancient cemetery of Hebron." The army hear that, and they told her, "Listen, the ancient cemetery of Hebron is far from Kiryat Arba. You're not going to be able to get there. He said, I want my son to be buried in Hebron. The chief officer of Hebron calls her up and says to her, Mrs. Nachshon, Sarah Nachshon, you have to understand, the defense minister of Israel does not allow it. You're not going to have permission to bury your son in Hebron. She decides to take her son in her hands and to walk by herself to the cemetery of Hebron. She starts walking, and the soldiers who are told to stop her says to his commander, I can't. She's carrying her baby, and she walks all the way down the street over here from, it's called Samet Zchuchit, and she takes her son and she buries him here, right over here. And anybody who was at that funeral will never forget that moment. And she says to those who ask her, she says, Abraham gave his life, made every effort to buy a plot, to purchase a plot for his wife Sarah. Here I am, Sarah Nachshon, coming to buy a plot for Abraham. And Avraham Nachshon, who was the first baby to be circumcised in the Ma'arat HaMachpelah since the Jewish re-establishment of Jewish settlement here, is also the first Jewish grave here in the Hebron cemetery after the Jewish people come back home to Hebron. Avraham Yedidya Nachshon will be remembered forever for the fact that his mother was determined to have his Brit Milah, his circumcision in the Me'arat HaMachpelah, and also to be the first one to be buried. Ever since that, we see many others who have been buried here. Unfortunately, each and every one of them is a story in itself. Here we have another child who was Yehoram Lapid. He, on Yom Kippur itself, he wanted to become purified. He sneaked into the spiritual ritual bath, the mikveh, and he drowned there. He was born in 1978. He passed away in 1983 when he falls into the mikveh of Kiryat Arba on Yom Kippur itself. The sad part of this story, we will see in a second, is his father and brother, Shalom and Mordechai Lapid, who were killed in Hebron by standing, waiting for a bus right near their house. And here they are buried here also in the cemetery. Each and every one of these children here has a story. We have many different stories here. We have this little girl here, Tamar, who was born in Ethiopia. Her family moved to Kiryat Arba. She was born in 1977, 11 years old. She passed away from an illness, and she is buried here. From Ethiopia, she made her way to Jerusalem in 1983 to live in Hebron. In 1988, she passed away and she's buried here. If you follow me right now, we will see now the modern part of the cemetery of Hebron. Not before we skip this part. In 1976, the day before Yom Kippur, hundreds of Arabs burst into the Ma'arat HaMachpelah, take down the holy scriptures, and they burn them. They burn 8 holy Torah scrolls Erev Yom Kippur. They were all buried here, and here we see the monument in the shape of a Sefer Torah, 1976. You can look through here, you can actually see the ashes of the Sifrei Torah themselves. אני לא יודע אם אתה רואה בגלל ההשתקפות, אבל אפשר לראות ממש את האפר. אני אעשה לך פה, ככה, זה עוזר לך שאני אעשה לך צלע. You can see the ashes of the Sifrei Torah. Now we can go into the modern part of the cemetery, and here, as I said before, we see these are people. Okay, okay. Here we have people that were killed, murdered. Netanel Ozeri, Yehudah Fartash, Nachum Hos. They were all killed and murdered here in Hebron. And as I mentioned before, we saw the child Yehoram Lapid. Here is the grave of his father and brother, Mordechai Lapid and Shalom Lapid. Actually, I personally knew them. Unfortunately, I personally knew many of the people that are buried here. Here we can see Mordechai and Shalom killed in the city of Hebron by hatred of Arab terrorists. They were killed in 1994 in Hebron. Okay, the story, each and every one of the people here has a story. Here we have each and every one of these people, the story. I'm not going to be able to tell the story of every one of them. We're going to continue on now towards the highlight of this tour, and we will be going to the tomb Me'arat HaMachpelah. We will be driving down there, passing through the new Jewish neighborhoods of Hebron. Rabbis and the rabbis' plot, from the desecrated Torah scrolls monument, from the 1929 martyrs section, and from the plot of the modern Jews living here, we see the connection throughout the history of the Jewish people, continuing and continuing, continuing and continuing, connecting to history of Israel, connecting to the land of Israel, connecting to our deep, deep roots, as they are here in Hebron. Many throughout history have tried to deny Jewish existence here, but we are here. We are here for good. We are here because our father Abraham taught us that famous word, Hineni. Here I am, ready for the mission that you, God, will appoint me for. Here I am, Hineni, ready to take upon myself. The majority, 97% of Hebron is in Arab hands. The Jews are allowed to live only in 3%. And here we are, the Jewish community living on this main street of Hebron. The name of the street, of course, is Rehov David HaMelech, King David Street. Here we see the house of the Jewish community, Beit Hadassah. Right over here, you can see Beit Hadassah. We can see Ad LaMe'ara. Here we see Beit Hadassah. We see right over here, behind over here, is the yeshiva of Hebron, Shavei Hebron, built in the house of Rabbi Chizkiah Medini. We didn't get a chance to mention, he was also buried in the cemetery. Rabbi Chizkiah Medini, he wrote an encyclopedia of all of the entire Talmudic concepts. He did it in a time when they didn't have Google, they didn't have computers. He did all a one-man project, encyclopedia. Here we have the Jewish ancient neighborhood of Avraham Avinu, Shchonat Avraham Avinu, and we are continuing on to the tomb of the patriarchs, to Me'arat HaMachpelah. We will be continuing on to Me'arat HaMachpelah. We're right now below Me'arat HaMachpelah. We can already see we're getting very close to it. Here we are. Right now we will be entering the parking lot of the Me'arat HaMachpelah. Here it is, right in front of us. tome of patriarchs.